When a man first saw fire, he didn't think, "This is dangerous." He thought, "This is alive." The fire looked at him the way fears would later look, not in his face, but within. At that moment, more than just a feeling was born in the psyche. A boundary was born. Before the fire, there was peace. After the fire, there came the realization that the world could destroy. And that it could warm. Fear then wasn't an enemy, but an initiation. Jung would say, it was here that man first encountered the archetype of the shadow, a force that isn't evil, but frightening because it's stronger than the ego. Later, the man was left alone in the desert. And that was a different kind of fear. Not a flash, but silence. Not a threat, but absence. The desert isn't a space, it's a state of mind when reflections disappear. No one confirms your existence. And then fear begins to speak with a voice, "Are you there?" And if you don't answer, it intensifies. Thus is born existential fear, not of death, but of dissolution. We still carry these two fears within us. One is like fire, sharp, triggering, instantaneous. The second is like the desert, slow, viscous, meaningless. The first is activated when we encounter the unknown. The second is when we are alone. And most people spend their entire lives running not from pain, but from this second fear, from the emptiness in which there is nothing to hide. The strangest thing is that the greatest fear never comes as a monster. It comes as a question. Sometimes at night. Sometimes in the pause between words. Sometimes in a moment of success, when suddenly it becomes quiet. Jung wrote, "Until you dare look at the shadow, it controls you from within." Fear is not something that frightens. It is something that wants to be seen. The person who saw fire for the first time could run away. But the one who stayed and looked became the keeper of the fire. Not because they became brave, but because they stopped pushing away the unknown. At this point, a shift occurs, fear ceases to be a reaction and becomes a guide. It points not to danger, but to an area for growth. That's why the most powerful triggers always point to something we haven't yet lived through. The desert does the same. It doesn't kill. It reveals. When roles, expectations, and noise disappear, what remains is the core. And if you're unfamiliar with it, panic sets in. Many confuse this with depression. But often it's not a fall, but an initiation. The psyche sheds the superfluous to reveal what's essential. And fear at this moment is like a guard at the entrance. Are you ready to see who you are without masks? The greatest fear cannot be conquered. It can only be encountered. And this encounter is always intimate. Without witnesses. Without heroism. You simply allow it to be. You don't analyze, you don't fight, you don't run. And then a paradox occurs, fear loses its form. Because it feeds on resistance. And when resistance disappears, it turns into energy. Jung called this integration. It's not light that conquers darkness, but consciousness that contains it. That's why people who have gone through deep fear become calm. Not loud. Not ostentatiously confident. But quietly stable. They've already been to the desert. They've already seen fire. They have nothing to prove. If you listen, fear always speaks of your future self. Of who you can become if you stop clinging to the old. It arises at the border of transition. As in ancient myths, there's always a monster at the entrance to the cave. But inside lies treasure. Not because the path is dangerous, but because transformation requires a price, the old identity. And perhaps the deepest insight here is that fear isn't a stop signal. It's a signal of depth. The greater the fear, the closer you are to your authentic self. A person who has seen fire has become human. A person who has survived the desert has become themselves. And if something resonates within you now, it doesn't necessarily have to be pain. Sometimes fear responds with silence. This means the subconscious has heard. And the conversation is just beginning. There's a moment rarely talked about. When fear no longer screams. When it settles close by. This is the moment when many are most frightened, because the familiar enemy disappears. There's nowhere to direct resistance. And suddenly it becomes clear, fear isn't something, but a state of contact with the unknown within. As if you were seeing your own depths for the first time and couldn't figure out where the bottom was. Jung called this an encounter with the self. Not with the image of a better self, but with that which exists before judgment. The self doesn't console. It simply is. And that's precisely why the ego begins to tremble. It no longer has anything to hold on to. At this point, people often return back. To the noise. To familiar roles. To pain, but familiar. Because familiar suffering is safer than the unknown wholeness. But if you stay. If you don't run. A strange thing happens, fear ceases to be personal. It becomes ancient. As if the experience of thousands of people before you is passing through you, those who also stood by the fire, who also lost their tracks in the sand. And then you understand, your fear isn't a mistake. It's part of human memory. An archetype that activates when you're ready to go beyond the old. The desert ceases to be empty at that moment. Signs appear. Not answers, but hints. Small sensations, coincidences, dreams. The psyche begins to speak in symbols, because direct language no longer works. Fear becomes a translator between consciousness and the depths. And if you listen, not interpret, clarity comes, but without words. There's a paradox. The greatest fear is always associated with loneliness, but you can only overcome it alone. No one can walk alongside you. Not because they don't want to, but because it's the path within. That's why in myths, the hero is always alone before the decisive test. Not because of the cruelty of the world, but because of the structure of the psyche. The inner fire cannot be divided. And at some point you notice, you no longer ask, why am I afraid? The question changes to, what awakens within me? This is the shift. Fear is no longer about danger, but about expansion. About the old form cracking. And the cracking feels like danger, although in reality it is a birth. Jung wrote that the unmet shadow becomes destiny. And the met shadow is a source of strength. But this strength is not aggressive. It is quiet. Like that of a person who is no longer afraid of silence. Who can be in the desert and not lose themselves? Who can look at a fire and not want to control it? And here is where the most important thing comes in. When fear is integrated, it no longer comes as a crisis. It comes as sensitivity. Such people are acutely aware of lies, in themselves and in others. They find it difficult to live superficially. They are drawn to the depths not because they seek drama, but because otherwise they cannot breathe. If you're listening to this now and you feel a pause, not an emotion, inside you, that's a sign. It means fear is no longer ahead. It's right here. And perhaps for the first time, you don't have to do anything about it. Not conquer it. Not analyze it. Not turn it into a goal. Just be with it. Because the greatest fear disappears not when it's gone, but when it no longer separates you from yourself. And then the path continues. But it's no longer about fear. It's about the responsibility to be who you became after this encounter. If you recognized something of yourself in these words, not necessarily fear, perhaps silence or warmth, write about it in the comments. Sometimes one short confession helps you see your path more clearly. Your response can become the very fire that will support not only you, but others as well. And here begins the most subtle stage. It is rarely spoken about because it is impossible to dramatize. There is no explosion, no catharsis, no light from heaven. There is ordinary life, and within it a new quality of presence. A person returns from the desert, but the sand remains in his gait. He returns from the fire, but the warmth is forever in his chest. And this is sometimes what is most frightening. the fear has disappeared, and with it the excuse not to live truly. Jung said that after individuation, a person can no longer be like everyone else. Not because he is superior, but because he can no longer lie to himself without physical pain. And here a new, quiet fear appears, the fear of responsibility for one's authenticity. Not external. Internal. The fear of not being able to hide. Of not betraying what was once seen. Many at this moment unconsciously seek to recapture old fears. They create chaos. They become drawn into other people's dramas. Because the old fear was a familiar home. But the new silence demands maturity. It does not promise permanent comfort, but offers wholeness. And the psyche tests, are you ready to be unmasked, even if you're not immediately understood? There's a feeling as if the world has become more subtle. People are more transparent. Words are heavier. You begin to feel not what they say, but where they're coming from. And if fear previously closed this sensitivity, now it's open. It's a gift and a burden at the same time. This is where many sensitive people begin to think that something is wrong with them. But in reality, nothing is turned off anymore. And then a new symbol appears, not fire or desert, but a path. Not a straight line, not heroic. Ordinary. But lived consciously. You walk, knowing that within there is a place where you've already been. Where you didn't die. Where you met yourself without form. And this knowledge becomes an inner support that cannot be taken away. Fear hasn't disappeared forever. It returns, but as a reminder. Like a gentle squeeze before an important step. Like a signal, you're at the border again. And if the border was frightening before, now it attracts. Because that's where you feel alive. Not adrenaline, but authenticity. Jung wrote that the meaning of life is not in getting rid of the darkness, but in the ability to bring light without denying the shadow. And at some point, you understand, the greatest fear was a teacher. Not a harsh one. An honest one. It didn't come to break. It came to dismantle the layers and reassemble them, closer to the center. And perhaps the most profound turning point happens when you begin to notice fear in others. Not judging. Not saving. But recognizing. You see a person, and you understand where they are on their journey. Some are still by the fire. Some are lost in the desert. And some are already returning, silently carrying warmth within. You no longer rush. You no longer push. You don't prove it. Because you know, every encounter with fear happens precisely at the right time. And no understanding can be rushed. You can only be there, or be an example, without calling it that. And if you've reached this point in the story and feel not a surge of inspiration, but a calm depth, then the conversation has reached the right level. From here, words will get in the way. From here, a personal journey begins. But it's no longer blind. It's illuminated by the same fire that once frightened you. Over time, a person notices, the greatest fear no longer appears suddenly. It comes beforehand, like a shadow on the sand before sunset. And you already know, a transition lies ahead. Not a catastrophe. Not a loss. But a change in the inner landscape. And if before you asked, why again, now another feeling arises, almost respect. Like an old guide silently pointing the way. And it is here that a quiet shift in consciousness occurs. You understand that fear was never against you. It was against sleep. Against life on autopilot. Against that part of you that agreed to exist halfway. Therefore, it struck at the most vulnerable places. Not to destroy, but to awaken. Jung wrote that a person becomes whole not when he gets rid of conflicts, but when he stops running from them. And then fear loses its poison. It becomes a form of energy that no longer tears apart from within, but gathers. As if the scattered parts of the psyche have finally found a common center. The desert at that moment ceases to be a test. It becomes a space of clarity. It's all simple there, either you walk or you stand. Either you hear yourself, or you search for the noise again. And you choose to walk. Not because you're brave, but because you don't want to return to the same cramped space. And the fire is inside now. Not like a flame, but like warmth. It doesn't burn. It supports. It's an internal guide that requires no proof. You know where the truth lies for you because your body is calm. Because the internal gap disappears. Because fear no longer controls your decisions. And here the final, most imperceptible transformation occurs. You stop looking for meaning. It's no longer ahead. It's in how you look, how you listen, how you remain silent. Life ceases to be a series of tests. It becomes a process of presence. And the fear that once seemed the greatest now looks like a door through which you entered yourself. You begin to understand others without words. To see their fears not as weakness, but as untapped depth. And this gives birth not to superiority, but to gentleness. Because you know the price of encounter. You know that you can't push it. You can only wait. Jung said, "He who looks outward is asleep. He who looks inward is awakening." And the greatest fear was the moment when the gaze finally turned. Not out of curiosity. Out of necessity. Because it became impossible to live the old way any longer. And perhaps the ending here is not in victory or liberation. The ending is in agreement. It's that you no longer divide yourself into light and terrifying. You become a container. And in this comes a peace that cannot be obtained from the outside. A man who has seen fire has learned not to fear power. A man who has walked through the desert has learned not to fear emptiness. And a man who has faced the greatest fear has ceased to be afraid of himself. And if now there is silence rather than applause within, it means the story has reached not just ears, but the place where fear once began and where there is no longer an enemy. If this story resonated with you, write in the comments what exactly you felt. One thought, one word, one memory. Your responses are important. They create a space where there are more of us, those who feel more deeply. Support the channel with likes and subscriptions. Thanks for watching.